Welcome to Fear of Darkness. Today's story is set in 1804, and it follows Tobias, the impossible tale of a black boy living inside the Destrehan Plantation mansion, in a place he was never meant to belong. What happened there was hidden for a reason, and one truth could cost him his life. This story is difficult and intense, so take a breath and listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and comment the city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the year 1804, on a sugar plantation 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, something occurred that no one could explain. A black child no older than 7 was found sleeping inside the main house of the Destrehan Plantation, not in the slave quarters, not in the fields, not in the kitchen dependency where enslaved workers prepared meals for the white family. He was discovered in the mansion itself, curled beneath a mahogany table in the grand parlor, his small body pressed against the cold wooden floor. The overseer who found him that morning raised his whip without hesitation. But before the leather could crack against the boy's skin, a voice stopped him cold. Wait. That voice belonged to Marie Celeste Robin de Logny Destrehan, the mistress of the house. And what she did next would set into motion a chain of events echoing through history for more than 200 years. This is the story of Tobias, a boy who was never supposed to exist in the records, whose name was erased from the plantation ledgers, a boy who witnessed secrets the wealthy sugar planters of Louisiana wanted buried forever. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful men try to destroy it. The Destrehan Plantation sat on the east bank of the Mississippi River, in a region French and Spanish colonizers called the German coast. The name came from German immigrants who had settled there in the 1720s, long before sugar became king. By 1804, the area had transformed into one of the most profitable stretches of land in the entire Louisiana Territory. Jean-Noel Destrehan was one of the wealthiest men in the region. His plantation produced over 200,000 pounds of sugar each year. That number meant nothing to most people. But to understand what it truly represented, you must understand what sugar demanded. Sugar cane is not like cotton or tobacco. It cannot wait. Once the cane is cut, it must be processed within hours, or the sucrose inside begins to break down. This meant that during harvest season, enslaved workers labored around the clock, 18 hours, 20 hours, sometimes more. They cut the cane with machetes under the brutal Louisiana sun. They fed the stalks into grinding mills powered by mules or by their own exhausted bodies. They boiled the juice in massive kettles, stirring constantly as the liquid reduced to crystals. The heat from those kettles could reach 250 degrees. Burns were common. Deaths were not rare. And the cycle never stopped until the last stalk was processed. In 1804, 59 enslaved human beings lived and worked on the Destrehan property. 59 people who woke before dawn and collapsed after dark. 59 people whose labor built the fortune that allowed Jean-Noel Destrehan to construct his grand house with its wide galleries and cypress columns. Tobias was not one of those 59. He appeared from nowhere, or so the records suggest. No bill of sale documented his purchase. No inventory listed his arrival. He simply materialized that October morning in 1804, a ghost child in a house built on the bones of his people. The overseer's name was Clement Brossard. He was a Creole man of French descent, thick-necked and quick-tempered, known throughout the German coast for his efficiency in extracting labor from enslaved workers. When he found the boy beneath the parlor table, his first instinct was violence. That was always his first instinct. But Marie Celeste stopped him. She was 43 years old that year, the daughter of a wealthy planter family, educated in ways most women of her time were not. She had married Jean-Noel when she was barely 16 and had spent nearly 3 decades managing the domestic operations of the plantation. She knew every enslaved person by name. She knew which ones could be trusted with household duties and which needed to be watched. She knew the rhythms of the sugar harvest and the economics of human bondage. What she did not know was why this child had appeared in her home. "Where did you come from?" she asked, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. Tobias did not answer. He could not answer. His tongue had been damaged somehow, whether by accident or deliberate cruelty, no one could determine. He communicated through gestures, expressions, a kind of silent language Marie Celeste found herself learning over the weeks that followed. The logical thing would have been to send him to the quarters, to put him to work alongside the other children hauling water, chasing birds from the cane fields, performing the 1,000 small tasks plantation owners assign to young slaves. That was what Clement Brossard wanted. That was what Jean Noël Destrehan expected. But Marie Celeste made a different choice. She kept him in the house. This decision defied every social convention of the time. Enslaved people were property. They were tools. They were not meant to occupy the same spaces as their owners, except when performing specific duties. A black child sleeping in the grand parlor was an abomination to the planter class, a violation of the natural order they had constructed to justify their wealth. Yet Marie Celeste kept him anyway. The official explanation, when questions arose, was that the boy served as a companion for the Destrehan children. Jean Noël and Marie Celeste had several sons and daughters, and it was not entirely unusual for wealthy families to assign enslaved children as playmates for their own offspring. This practice served multiple purposes. It provided companionship for isolated plantation children, it began conditioning enslaved children for a lifetime of service, and it reinforced the hierarchy from the earliest possible age, teaching white children to command and black children to obey. But Tobias was different. He did not obey. The first sign of his defiance came within a week of his discovery. One of the Destrehan sons, a boy of 9 named Nicholas, had taken to tormenting Tobias whenever the adults were not watching. He would pinch him, pull his hair, kick dirt on his food, common behaviors among planter children who learned cruelty as naturally as they learned to walk. One afternoon, Nicholas pushed Tobias into the mud behind the kitchen dependency. He laughed as Tobias struggled to rise, his small body coated in thick Louisiana earth. Then he pushed him again. What happened next was witnessed by an enslaved woman named Josephine, who worked in the kitchen. She would later recount the story to her children, who passed it down to their children, who eventually shared it with historians searching for fragments of the past. Tobias rose from the mud. He looked at Nicholas with eyes that held no fear. And then he smiled. It was not a submissive smile. It was not the smile of a child seeking approval or trying to defuse a dangerous situation. It was something else entirely, something that made Nicholas step backward without understanding why. Then Tobias walked away. He walked past Nicholas, past the kitchen, past the slave quarters, directly toward the main house. He walked through the front door, which enslaved people were forbidden to use. He walked across the cypress floors, leaving muddy footprints with every step. And he walked into the parlor where Marie Celeste sat reading correspondence from New Orleans. She looked up at the mud-covered child standing before her. She looked at the trail of dirt he had tracked through her home. And according to Josephine's account, she did something remarkable. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a dismissive laugh, but a genuine sound of amusement, as if the boy had performed some clever trick that delighted her. "Well," she said, setting aside her letters, "it seems you have something to tell me." And from that moment, something shifted in the Destrehan household. Jean Noël Destrehan was not a sentimental man. He had been born into wealth, educated in the ways of commerce and law, and he understood that his prosperity depended on the brutal machinery of slavery. He did not question the system because the system benefited him. He did not see enslaved people as fully human because acknowledging their humanity would have made his entire existence unconscionable. But even Jean Noël could not ignore what was happening with Tobias. The boy had a gift. Or perhaps gift is not the right word. He had an ability no one could explain. He knew things he should not have known, things he could not have known. The first instance Jean Noël witnessed personally occurred in November of 1804. He had been expecting a shipment of supplies from New Orleans, a flatboat carrying tools, fabric, and provisions for the coming winter. The boat was 2 days late, and Jean Noël was growing concerned. River travel was dangerous. Pirates operated along certain stretches. Accidents happened. Tobias approached him on the gallery that overlooked the Mississippi. The boy pointed downriver toward New Orleans. Then he held up 3 fingers. Jean Noël dismissed the gesture. The boy was simple-minded, he assumed, damaged in ways that went beyond his inability to speak. 3 days later, the flatboat arrived. It had been delayed by low water near Baton Rouge. Jean Noel might have attributed this to coincidence. He probably would have forgotten it entirely if the same thing had not happened again, and again, and again. Tobias knew when storms were coming before the clouds appeared on the horizon. He knew when enslaved workers were planning to run before they made their move. He knew when visitors would arrive from New Orleans, sometimes days in advance. He could not explain how he knew these things. He could only point and gesture and hope someone would understand. Marie Celeste understood. She began keeping a journal of Tobias's predictions. She recorded each one with the precision of a scientist conducting an experiment: date, prediction, outcome. Over 6 months, she documented 47 instances in which Tobias had accurately foretold events before they occurred. 44 of those predictions proved correct. The journal would not survive. It was likely destroyed in the years following 1811, when the events of the German coast uprising led powerful men to burn anything that might connect them to what had happened. But its existence was confirmed by multiple sources, including letters Marie Celeste sent to her sister in New Orleans. What was Tobias? This question haunted the Destrehan household throughout 1805. Some of the enslaved workers believed he was touched by spirits, blessed or cursed with second sight. Others whispered that he was not entirely human, that perhaps he had been born in the swamps to a mother who had made deals with forces beyond understanding. The white residents of neighboring plantations had their own theories, most involving demonic possession or African witchcraft. The truth, as far as it can be reconstructed, was probably simpler. Tobias was extraordinarily observant. He noticed patterns others missed. He watched the behavior of animals before storms. He studied the faces of enslaved workers and detected the subtle signs of desperation that preceded escape attempts. He paid attention to the rhythm of river traffic and learned to predict arrivals based on seasonal patterns. His silence forced him to communicate through observation. And that observation became his power. But power, even the power of a mute, enslaved child, was dangerous in 1804 Louisiana, especially for a black boy living in a white man's house. The trouble began with the neighbors. Jacques Fortier owned a plantation several miles downriver from the Destrehans. He was a friend of Jean Noel's, a fellow member of the planter elite, and a man who believed deeply in the proper ordering of society. When he heard rumors about the strange child living in the Destrehan mansion, he came to investigate. What he found disgusted him. Tobias was seated at a small table in the corner of the dining room, eating from a ceramic plate while the Destrehan family consumed their evening meal. This was unprecedented. Enslaved people did not eat in the same room as their owners. They certainly did not eat at the same time, from the same dishes, prepared by the same hands. Jean Noel, Fortier said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "Might I have a word?" The conversation that followed took place on the gallery, out of earshot of the family. But Clement Brossard, the overseer, was standing nearby. He heard everything, and he would later use what he heard to advance his own position. "This cannot continue," Fortier said. "You are making a mockery of everything we have built here." Jean Noel attempted to explain. The boy was useful, he argued. His abilities had proven valuable in predicting weather and managing labor. Keeping him close allowed the family to benefit from his strange gifts. Fortier was not convinced. "You are teaching him that he is equal," Fortier said. "You are showing every slave on this coast that a black child can sit at a white man's table. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what happens when they start believing they deserve the same treatment?" Jean Noel understood. He had grown up in this system. He knew that its survival depended on absolute hierarchy, on the constant reinforcement of white superiority and black inferiority. Every meal Tobias ate in that dining room was a crack in the foundation. But he also knew what his wife would say if he tried to remove the boy. Marie Celeste had become attached to Tobias in ways Jean Noel could not fully comprehend. She spoke to him as if he could respond. She taught him letters and numbers, scratching them in the dirt of the garden when no one else was watching. She protected him from the casual violence that defined life on the plantation, intervening whenever Clement Brossard or any other white person raised a hand against him. This attachment was dangerous, not just for Tobias, but for Marie Celeste herself. Women of her class were expected to maintain emotional distance from the enslaved people they owned. Affection was weakness. Weakness invited chaos. Jean Noel decided to compromise. Tobias would remain in the house, but he would no longer eat with the family. He would sleep in a small room adjacent to the kitchen, not in the main house itself. He would perform duties appropriate to his station, fetching, carrying, cleaning, and he would never, under any circumstances, be treated as an equal. Marie Celeste agreed to these terms. But she did not follow them. The secret education continued. Marie Celeste had taught 3 of her own children to read, and she applied the same methods to Tobias. Within a year, he could recognize most common words. Within 2 years, he could read simple texts, though he communicated his understanding only through gestures and nods. This was illegal. Louisiana law explicitly prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write. The penalty for violation was severe. Enslaved individuals caught reading could be whipped, mutilated, or killed. White people who facilitated literacy faced fines and imprisonment. The law existed because slaveholders understood a fundamental truth: literacy was power. An enslaved person who could read could access information. They could communicate secretly. They could organize. They could resist. Marie Celeste knew the law. She broke it anyway. Why? This question has puzzled historians for generations. Some have argued she was motivated by Christian charity, a desire to save the boy's soul through education. Others have suggested more practical considerations, that a literate slave might prove useful for complex household management. Still others have proposed that Marie Celeste simply recognized something in Tobias that transcended the categories of her time, a spark of intelligence and will that demanded nurturing. The truth probably contained elements of all these explanations. Human motivation is rarely simple. Whatever her reasons, Marie Celeste's secret education of Tobias would have consequences neither of them could foresee. In the spring of 1806, a new face appeared on the German coast. His name was Charles Deslandes, and he arrived at the plantation of the widow Deslandes, adjacent to the property of Manuel Andre. He was a mulatto man in his late teens or early 20s, brought from Saint-Domingue, the island that had recently become the independent nation of Haiti. The Haitian Revolution had terrified white slaveholders throughout the Americas. For the first time in history, enslaved people had successfully overthrown their masters and established their own nation. The revolution had been violent beyond imagination. Thousands of white colonists had been killed. Plantations had burned. The entire social order had been inverted. Refugees from Saint-Domingue brought more than their possessions to Louisiana. They brought stories. And among the enslaved people they transported, they brought revolutionary ideas. Charles Deslandes was one of these transported individuals. He worked as a driver on Manuel Andre's plantation, a position that gave him authority over other enslaved workers. Drivers were typically chosen for their intelligence and ability to command respect. They occupied an ambiguous space between the enslaved masses and the white power structure, trusted enough to supervise labor, but never trusted enough to be free. Deslandes had witnessed the Haitian Revolution. He had seen what was possible when enslaved people united against their oppressors. And he began, slowly and carefully, to spread those ideas along the German coast. Tobias encountered Deslandes for the first time in June of 1806. The meeting occurred by accident. Jean Noel Destrehan had business with Manuel Andre, something related to sugar prices and labor allocation. He brought Tobias along because Marie Celeste insisted the boy needed fresh air, and because Tobias's predictions had proven useful in gauging the trustworthiness of business partners. At Andre's plantation, Tobias wandered away from the main house while the adults conducted their affairs. He explored the grounds with the quiet curiosity that characterized everything he did, observing the workers in the fields, the tools in the sheds, the rhythms of labor that define plantation life. He found Deslandes near the slave quarters, speaking quietly with a group of young men. The conversation stopped when Tobias approached. The men looked at him with suspicion. A child from another plantation, especially one who served the white family, could be a spy. Information had value, and betrayal could mean death. But Destrehan studied Tobias carefully. He noted the intelligence in the boy's eyes. He observed the way Tobias stood, not with the hunched posture of submission most enslaved children adopted, but upright, alert, present. "You don't speak," Destrehan said. It was not a question. Tobias shook his head. "But you listen." Tobias nodded. Destrehan smiled. It was a cautious smile, guarded, but genuine. "Listeners are valuable," he said. "Speakers get themselves killed. Listeners survive." This brief exchange would prove prophetic in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The summer of 1806 was brutal. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees, and the humidity made the air feel like wet cloth pressed against the skin. Enslaved workers collapsed in the fields. 2 died on the Destrehan property alone, their bodies giving out under the combined assault of heat and labor. Tobias spent most of that summer inside the main house, where thick walls and high ceilings provided some relief from the oppressive weather. Marie Celeste continued his education, advancing to more complex texts and introducing basic arithmetic. She began teaching him to write, guiding his hand across paper to form letters and words. This was the most dangerous phase of his secret schooling. Reading could be concealed. A boy could be caught with a book and claim he was simply looking at the pictures. But writing was deliberate. Writing was intentional. Writing was unmistakable evidence of education. Tobias understood the risk. He practiced only in private, destroying every paper as soon as the lesson ended. He never wrote in the presence of anyone but Marie Celeste. He never gave any indication he possessed this forbidden skill, until the incident with Clement Brossard. It happened in August, during the height of harvest preparation. Brossard had been drinking, as he often did when the pressure of his position became too great. He was responsible for extracting maximum labor from 59 enslaved human beings, and that responsibility weighed on him in ways he could not acknowledge. So he drank. And when he drank, he became violent. That evening, he encountered Tobias near the kitchen dependency. The boy was carrying a bucket of water, performing one of the menial tasks assigned to justify his presence in the household. Brossard blocked his path. "You think you're special?" Brossard said, his words slurring slightly. "You think because Madame protects you, you're different from the rest of them." Tobias did not respond. He could not respond. But he met Brossard's eyes without flinching. This was a mistake. Enslaved people were expected to avert their gaze when confronted by whites. Direct eye contact was interpreted as challenge, as defiance, as a refusal to accept one's place in the hierarchy. Tobias had spent too much time in the presence of Marie Celeste, who encouraged him to look at her when she spoke. He had forgotten the rules that governed his interactions with everyone else. Brossard's hands shot out and grabbed Tobias by the throat. The bucket clattered to the ground, water splashing across the packed earth. "You look at me like that again," Brossard hissed, "and I will kill you. I don't care what Madame says. I don't care what Master says. You are property. You are nothing. And I will remind you of that every day for the rest of your miserable life." He released Tobias with a shove that sent the boy sprawling. Then he walked away, leaving Tobias gasping in the dirt. This encounter changed something in Tobias. He had experienced cruelty before. He had witnessed violence against other enslaved people throughout his time at Destrehan. But this was the first time violence had been directed specifically at him. The first time he had felt the weight of his position in this brutal system. That night, he did something he had never done before. He wrote. On a scrap of paper stolen from Marie Celeste's desk, using a stub of pencil he had hidden in his sleeping area, he wrote 3 words. "I will remember." He did not know what those words meant. He did not know what he intended to remember, or what he planned to do with that memory. But the act of writing them down transformed something abstract into something concrete. His suffering had been recorded. His determination had been documented. His humanity had been asserted in the only medium available to him. He burned the paper immediately afterward, watching the flames consume his words. But the act itself could not be undone. He had written. He had expressed himself in the language of his oppressors. He had claimed a power they had tried to deny him. And he would not forget. The autumn of 1806 brought a visitor to the Destrehan Plantation. His name was Jean-Baptiste Labatut, and he was one of the most prominent lawyers in New Orleans. He arrived on a flatboat laden with legal documents and a mission that would alter the trajectory of the entire region. President Thomas Jefferson had purchased the Louisiana Territory from France just 3 years earlier. The legal status of the region remained chaotic. Spanish law still governed many aspects of daily life. French customs persisted in social interactions. And American ideals, particularly regarding the expansion of slavery, were beginning to reshape the political landscape. Labatut had been hired by a consortium of sugar planters, including Jean Noel Destrehan, to ensure their property rights would be protected under the new American administration. This meant navigating a complex web of competing legal systems, validating land grants, confirming ownership of enslaved people, and establishing the mechanisms by which the planter class would maintain its power. Tobias was present during several of Labatut's meetings with Jean Noel. His role was ostensibly to serve refreshments, but Marie Celeste had positioned him deliberately. She wanted to know what was being discussed. She wanted to understand the political currents that would shape her family's future. What Tobias observed during those meetings would haunt him for the rest of his life. Labatut spoke casually about the enslaved population. He used numbers and percentages, discussing human beings as if they were livestock or machinery. He calculated the value of different categories of workers: prime field hands, skilled artisans, house servants, children, women of childbearing age. Each category had a price. Each price could be negotiated. Each negotiation was conducted with the cold precision of men who had convinced themselves they were engaging in ordinary commerce. But one conversation stood out above the rest. "The Americans are concerned about insurrection," Labatut said, sipping brandy Tobias had poured moments earlier. "They've heard about what happened in Saint-Domingue. They're worried the same thing could happen here." Jean Noel nodded gravely. "We all worry about that. The solution is control," Labatut continued. "Absolute control. The moment you allow them to believe they have any power, any autonomy, any hope of change, you've lost. You must break them completely. Not just their bodies, but their spirits. They must believe, in the deepest part of themselves, that they are meant to serve, that they are incapable of anything else, that freedom is not just impossible, but unthinkable." He paused, swirling his brandy. "That's why literacy is so dangerous. That's why we can never allow them to read. Words give them ideas. Ideas give them hope. Hope gives them courage. And courage makes them dangerous." Tobias stood perfectly still throughout this speech, his face expressionless, his posture submissive. He gave no indication he understood what was being said. He gave no sign he could read the documents spread across the table. He was invisible, in the way all enslaved servants were expected to be invisible. But inside, something was burning. He had been taught to read by the very woman who profited from his enslavement. He had been given the gift Labatut declared most dangerous. And now he understood why, not just the practical reasons, but the philosophical foundations of the system that imprisoned him. They were afraid. Behind all their power, behind all their wealth, behind all their violence, they were afraid. They knew their system was built on lies. They knew enslaved people were not inferior, not incapable, not meant to serve. They knew the only thing maintaining their position was force. And they knew that if enslaved people ever realized their own strength, everything would collapse. This knowledge did not bring Tobias joy. It did not bring him hope. It brought him something more complex, more difficult to name. It brought him awareness. He saw the system clearly for the first time. Saw its brutality and its fragility. Saw the terror that motivated its defenders and the violence that sustained it. And he began to understand that change was possible. Not today. Not tomorrow. Maybe not even in his lifetime. But possible. The winter of 1806 was mild by Louisiana standards, which meant the enslaved population had slightly more energy than usual to devote to activities beyond their required labor. On Sunday evenings, when custom permitted a few hours of rest, groups would gather in the quarters to share news, tell stories, and maintain the cultural traditions that connected them to Africa and to each other. Tobias began attending these gatherings. He was accepted because he was young, and because his silence made him seem harmless. The adults spoke freely in his presence, sharing information they would never have revealed to a speaking child who might accidentally repeat what he had heard. Through these gatherings, Tobias learned about the network connecting enslaved communities across the German coast. He learned that information traveled faster among the enslaved than among the planters, that news of escapes, punishments, and death spread within hours through channels white people never suspected. He learned about the Maroons, communities of escaped slaves who lived in the swamps, surviving by hunting, fishing, and raiding isolated plantations. And he learned about Charles Deslands. Deslands had become a legend among the enslaved population. He was said to be fearless. He was said to have connections to Haiti, to leaders who had actually overthrown the white masters and taken control of their own nation. He was said to be planning something, though no one knew exactly what. Tobias listened to all of this. He filed it away in the same part of his mind where he stored weather patterns and river traffic and the subtle expressions that predicted human behavior. He did not know how or when this information might become useful. But he knew it had value. And he continued to learn. Marie Celeste's lessons grew more sophisticated as 1807 approached. She began teaching Tobias geography, showing him maps of Louisiana, of the United States, of the world beyond. She explained the political situation, the tensions between different factions vying for control of the territory. She discussed the economy, the way sugar prices rose and fell based on distant events in Europe and the Caribbean. She was educating him deliberately and thoroughly to understand the world that enslaved him. Why? This question becomes more pressing as the story continues. Marie Celeste was not an abolitionist. She owned enslaved people and benefited enormously from their labor. She had no intention of freeing Tobias or anyone else. Her entire way of life depended on the continuation of slavery. Yet she dedicated years to giving this one child the intellectual tools to comprehend his situation. Some historians have suggested she was simply bored. Wealthy women on isolated plantations had limited outlets for their intelligence, and teaching might have provided stimulation she could not find elsewhere. Others have proposed she saw Tobias as a kind of experiment, a test of what enslaved people might accomplish if given the same advantages as white children. But there is another possibility, one that emerges from the fragments of evidence that survive. Marie Celeste knew the system was unsustainable. She had read the reports from Saint-Domingue. She understood the mathematics of oppression, the way a small white population could only control a large enslaved population through constant violence and perpetual vigilance. She had seen the brutality of Clement Brossard and men like him, the casual cruelty necessary to maintain order, and she suspected that eventually, inevitably, the enslaved population would rise. When that happened, she wanted someone who might remember her differently. Not as a slaveholder, not as an oppressor, but as a human being who had tried, in whatever small way, to acknowledge the humanity of those she enslaved. It was not justice. It was not redemption. It was something smaller and more selfish, a desperate attempt to salvage some fragment of her legacy from the moral catastrophe in which she was embedded. And it would not be enough. The year 1807 brought intensifying tensions to the German coast. The American authorities were tightening their control over the territory, implementing new regulations that restricted the movement of enslaved people and increased punishments for various offenses. At the same time, the enslaved population was growing. Sugar required labor, and labor required bodies, and bodies were imported in ever-increasing numbers from Africa and the Caribbean. More bodies meant more potential for resistance. Jean-Noel Destrehan responded to this threat by increasing security on his property. He hired additional patrollers, white men who rode the roads at night looking for escapees. He built stronger locks on the slave quarters. He instructed Clement Brossard to use more severe punishments for minor infractions. The atmosphere on the plantation grew heavier. Enslaved workers who had once moved with some degree of freedom now found themselves under constant surveillance. Conversations were monitored. Gatherings were dispersed. The Sunday evening meetings in the quarters were banned outright. Tobias felt the change more acutely than most. His position in the household became increasingly precarious. Jean Noel began questioning why the boy was still present, why he had not been sent to the fields now that he was old enough for physical labor. Clement Brossard advocated loudly for his removal, arguing that his continued presence undermined discipline among the other enslaved workers. Marie Celeste defended him. But her arguments were growing weaker. The political climate had shifted. The tolerance that had allowed Tobias to remain in the house was evaporating. In September of 1807, Jean Noel made his decision. Tobias would be sold. Marie Celeste learned of this plan by accident. She overheard her husband discussing terms with a slave trader from Natchez, a man known for purchasing children and transporting them to cotton plantations in the interior. The prices were good. The market was strong. There was no reason to keep a mute boy who contributed nothing to the household. She confronted Jean Noel that evening in the privacy of their bedchamber. "You cannot sell him," she said. "He is property," Jean Noel replied. "I can do whatever I wish with him. He is a child. He is a slave. There is no difference." Marie Celeste had never directly challenged her husband's authority. The social conventions of her time made such challenges almost unthinkable. A wife was expected to defer to her husband in all significant matters, to manage her domain without questioning his decisions. But this was different. "If you sell him," she said, "I will never forgive you." Jean Noel looked at his wife with an expression that combined surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear. In 27 years of marriage, she had never spoken to him this way. "What is he to you?" Jean Noel demanded. "Why does this boy matter more than the 50 others we own? Why do you protect him so fiercely?" Marie Celeste did not answer. Perhaps she could not answer. Perhaps the reasons were too complex, too tangled, too shameful to articulate. Jean Noel made his own interpretation. "You've grown too attached," he said coldly. "It's unhealthy. It's dangerous. And it ends now." He left the room without waiting for a response. Marie Celeste sat alone for a long time after he departed. She thought about Tobias. She thought about the years she had spent teaching him, the hours of secret lessons, the slow accumulation of knowledge she had poured into his silent mind. She thought about the system that made him property and her complicit in his enslavement. And she made a decision that would change everything. She would not let Jean Noel sell Tobias. She would not let the boy disappear into the brutal machinery of the cotton frontier. She would find another way. The plan Marie Celeste developed was desperate, dangerous, and almost certainly illegal. But she had resources most women of her time did not possess. She had education. She had connections. And she had something even her husband did not fully appreciate. She had land. Under Louisiana civil law, married women retained certain property rights that did not exist in the common law states. Marie Celeste had inherited a small parcel of land from her father, land that remained legally separate from her husband's estate. This land included no enslaved people. It produced no sugar. It had almost no economic value. But it belonged to her. On September 23, 1807, Marie Celeste did something extraordinary. She drafted a document in her own hand, declaring she was transferring ownership of the enslaved child known as Tobias to herself, using funds derived from her personal property. She documented a fictional purchase price. She created a paper trail that would make the transaction appear legitimate. Then she hid the document in a place no one would think to look. This was fraud. This was forgery. This was a crime that could result in significant penalties if discovered. But Marie Celeste calculated that her husband would never examine the legal details closely enough to detect the deception. He would simply accept that the boy had been removed from his inventory and assume the sale had proceeded as planned. She was wrong. Clement Brossard found the document. He had been searching Marie Celeste's private chambers on Jean Noel's orders, looking for evidence of improper behavior that might justify more drastic actions. What he found was far worse than Jean Noel had imagined. A white woman had committed fraud to protect an enslaved child. The implications were staggering. Brossard brought the document directly to Jean Noel. He presented it with barely concealed triumph, vindication of every suspicion he had harbored about the mistress and her unnatural attachment to the slave boy. Jean Noel's reaction was not what Brossard expected. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He simply looked at the document for a long time, his face unreadable. "Leave us," he said finally. Brossard hesitated. He had expected rewards, praise, perhaps advancement in his position. Instead, he was being dismissed like a servant. "Sir, surely you must leave now." Brossard left. Jean Noel sat alone with the document in his hands. He thought about his wife. He thought about their marriage. He thought about the life they had built together on the backs of enslaved people. And he thought about Tobias. What happened in that room in the hours that followed would never be fully documented. But when Jean Noel emerged the next morning, he gave orders that surprised everyone on the plantation. Tobias would remain. The document would be destroyed. And no one would ever speak of this matter again. Why Jean Noel made this decision is one of the enduring mysteries of this story. Perhaps he feared scandal. Perhaps he loved his wife despite everything. Perhaps he saw something in Tobias that intrigued him, some echo of the abilities Marie Celeste had recognized years earlier. Or perhaps he understood, on some level, that the system he depended on was crumbling, and that kindness to one child might somehow matter when the reckoning finally came. Whatever his reasons, Tobias survived. But survival was only the beginning. The year 1808 brought new challenges and new opportunities. The international slave trade was officially abolished on January 1st, meaning no more enslaved people could be legally imported from Africa. This did not end slavery. It did not even reduce the enslaved population significantly. But it changed the economics of the system, making existing enslaved people more valuable and increasing the incentives for breeding rather than importation. It also intensified the desperation of those who saw no hope of change. Charles Deslandes had been building his network for 2 years. He had identified potential allies on plantations throughout the German coast. He had established communication channels with Maroon communities in the swamps. He had studied the lessons of the Haitian Revolution and adapted them to local conditions. He was preparing for war. Tobias knew none of this. He had been isolated from the enslaved community since the near sale of 1807, kept close to the main house and away from situations where he might hear dangerous information. Marie Celeste had become protective to the point of suffocation, unwilling to risk any situation that might threaten her fragile arrangement with Jean Noel. But isolation could not last forever. In the summer of 1808, Tobias turned 11 years old. He was growing quickly, his body lengthening and strengthening in ways that made his continued role as a house servant increasingly difficult to justify. Jean Noel began pressuring Marie Celeste to reassign him to field work, arguing the boy was wasting his potential in domestic service. Marie Celeste resisted. But her influence was waning. The political situation in the household had shifted. Jean Noel no longer trusted her judgment on matters relating to the enslaved population. Clement Brossard had gained power in the aftermath of the document incident, and he used that power to advocate constantly for harsher treatment of all enslaved people, but especially of Tobias. The crisis came in August. A fever swept through the slave quarters, killing 7 people in 2 weeks. Among the dead was a man named Thomas, who had served as Jean Noel's personal attendant for more than a decade. His death created a vacancy that needed to be filled. Jean Noel chose Tobias. This decision was surprising for several reasons. The position of personal attendant was one of the most privileged roles an enslaved person could hold. It required constant proximity to the master, access to private spaces and private conversations, and a level of trust rarely extended to anyone. Giving this position to a mute child who could not even respond to verbal commands seemed illogical. But Jean Noel had his reasons. He had been watching Tobias for years. He had seen the predictions come true. He had observed the boy's intelligence, his composure, his ability to understand complex situations without speaking a word. And he had begun to wonder if perhaps Tobias might prove useful in ways no one had anticipated. What Jean Noel did not know was that Tobias had been watching him, too. Every meal he served, every conversation he overheard, every document that passed through his hands, Tobias remembered everything. He assembled a picture of Jean Noel Destrehan's business dealings, his political connections, his fears and ambitions and secrets. He knew which neighbors Jean Noel trusted and which he despised. He knew the state of the plantation's finances. He knew the names of the men in New Orleans who held power over the territory. And he knew that Jean Noel was afraid. The fear was subtle, visible only to someone who had spent years learning to read human expressions. But it was there, lurking beneath the confidence and authority. Jean Noel feared the enslaved people he owned. He feared the changes coming to Louisiana. He feared that everything he had built might be swept away in the kind of violent upheaval that had consumed Saint-Domingue. This fear made him dangerous. Frightened men do desperate things. They lash out. They overreact. They destroy what they cannot control. Tobias understood this. And he understood that his survival depended on navigating Jean Noel's fear without triggering the violence it contained. The autumn of 1808 was deceptively peaceful. The sugar harvest proceeded smoothly. No major storms disrupted the processing. Prices remained strong. Jean Noel's fortune continued to grow. But beneath the surface, forces were gathering. Charles Deslandes had completed his network. He had recruited allies on plantations from Laplace to Kenner. He had stockpiled weapons, hidden them in the swamps where the Maroons lived. He had developed a plan, a detailed strategy for seizing control of New Orleans and establishing a free black republic in Louisiana. The revolution would come, not this year, not the next, but soon. And when it came, Tobias would be forced to choose between the family that had sheltered him and the people who shared his chains, between survival and justice, between the impossible life he had built and the impossible future that awaited. This is where the first part of Tobias's story ends. But the story itself is far from over. In 1811, when the German coast exploded in the largest slave revolt in American history, Tobias would be there. He would witness things history has tried to forget. He would make choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And the Destrehan Plantation, where he had lived his impossible existence as a black boy in a white man's world, would become the site of a tribunal that would sentence dozens of freedom fighters to death. But that is a story for another time. The year 1809 began with death. On January 3rd, a cold rain fell across the German coast, turning the roads to mud and the fields to swamps. That morning, Marie Celeste Robin de Logny Destrehan woke with a fever that would not break. By evening, she could no longer recognize her own children. By midnight, she was gone. Tobias was not permitted to attend the funeral. He stood at the window of the kitchen dependency, watching from a distance as the white mourners gathered around the grave. He saw Jean Noel, his face rigid with grief he could not express. He saw the Destrehan children, confused and frightened by the sudden absence of their mother. He saw the neighboring planters, men like Jacques Fortier and Manuel André, offering condolences that meant nothing. And he felt something break inside him. Marie Celeste had been many things. She had been a slaveholder, a beneficiary of a system built on human suffering. She had been complicit in atrocities she could have opposed but chose to ignore. She had owned human beings and profited from their labor. But she had also been the only person who had ever treated Tobias as fully human. She had taught him to read. She had taught him to write. She had given him the tools to understand the world that imprisoned him. Without her, he would have been just another anonymous body in the machinery of the plantation, worked until he broke, then discarded. Because of her, he was something else. Something the system was never meant to create. An educated slave, a witness, a recorder of truths powerful men wanted buried. In the weeks following Marie Celeste's death, everything changed. Jean Noel retreated into grief and alcohol. He stopped managing the plantation directly, leaving daily operations to Clement Brossard. He stopped attending social functions. He stopped caring about the details that had once consumed his attention. Brossard seized this opportunity. Within a month, he had reorganized the entire labor system on the Destrehan property. Work hours increased. Rations decreased. Punishments became more frequent and more severe. The enslaved population, which had experienced a relatively moderate regime under Jean Noel's direct supervision, now faced the full brutality of a man who saw them as nothing more than tools to be used and broken. Tobias's position became precarious. Without Marie Celeste's protection, he had no defender in the household. Jean Noel barely acknowledged his existence. The other house servants resented him for his years of privilege. And Brossard had never forgotten the humiliation of being dismissed when he discovered the fraudulent document. The overseer began a campaign of deliberate cruelty. He assigned Tobias the most degrading tasks: cleaning chamber pots, disposing of waste, working in conditions no house servant would normally face. He made sure Tobias was always hungry, always exhausted, always reminded of his true place in the hierarchy. But he could not break him. This was what infuriated Brossard most. Other enslaved people, when subjected to this treatment, eventually collapsed. Their spirits shattered. They became compliant, submissive, broken in the way the system required. Tobias did not break. He performed every task assigned to him. He endured every humiliation. He accepted every punishment without complaint, without resistance, without any outward sign of the rage that burned inside him. And every night, in the darkness of his sleeping space, he wrote. He had hidden paper and pencil in places Brossard would never think to search. He recorded everything: the names of the enslaved people on the plantation, the punishments they received, the deaths that occurred, the cruelties that went unwitnessed by anyone who might care. He was creating a record, a document of suffering, a testament to what happened in places like the Destrehan Plantation, where human beings were treated as property and their pain was considered irrelevant. He did not know what he would do with this record. He did not know if anyone would ever read it. But the act of writing gave him power. It reminded him he was more than what they said he was. It kept alive the spark Marie Celeste had ignited. And it connected him to something larger than himself. The summer of 1809 brought Tobias back into contact with Charles Deslands. It happened during one of Jean Noel's rare ventures outside the plantation. Business required him to visit Manuel Andre's property, and he brought Tobias along out of habit more than intention. The boy had served as his attendant for nearly a year, and Jean Noel had grown accustomed to his silent presence. At Andre's plantation, Tobias was left to wait near the slave quarters while the white men conducted their affairs. It was there that Deslands found him. The revolutionary had changed in the 3 years since their first meeting. He was older now, harder, his face marked by the accumulated weight of planning and waiting. But his eyes still held the same fire Tobias remembered. "I heard about your mistress," Deslands said quietly, positioning himself so they appeared to be two slaves engaged in casual conversation. "I heard she was good to you." Tobias nodded. "Good is relative," Deslands continued. "She owned you. She profited from your suffering. She could have freed you, but chose not to. That is not goodness. That is slightly less evil." Tobias had no response to this. He had thought the same things himself in the dark hours after Marie Celeste's death. He had wrestled with the contradiction of mourning someone who had been both his teacher and his jailer. "But I did not come to discuss the dead," Deslands said. "I came to discuss the living. And the future." He glanced around, confirming Northwest One was close enough to overhear. "Things are changing on the coast. The Americans are tightening their grip. The planters are getting more afraid. And afraid men make mistakes." Tobias listened. "When the time comes," Deslands said, "there will be a choice. Every enslaved person on this coast will have to decide, stay and submit, or rise and fight." He looked directly at Tobias. "You are different from the others. You live in the big house. You see things field hands never see. You know things that could be useful." Tobias understood what was being asked. Deslands wanted information. He wanted a spy inside the Destrehan household, someone who could report on the planters' plans and movements. But Tobias also understood the danger. If he was caught passing information to Deslands, death would be the kindest punishment he could expect. He hesitated. Deslands read the hesitation correctly. "I am not asking you to decide now," he said. "I am asking you to remember that the choice exists. When you are ready, find a way to contact me. Until then, watch. Listen. Learn." He moved away before Tobias could respond. But the conversation had planted a seed. The autumn of 1809 brought a new presence to the Destrehan Plantation. Her name was Celestine, and she arrived as part of a group of enslaved people purchased from a failing plantation near Baton Rouge. She was 16 years old, tall and strong, with a fierce intelligence she had learned to hide behind a mask of compliance. She was assigned to the kitchen, where she worked alongside the older women who prepared meals for the white family. Her duties brought her into regular contact with Tobias, who still carried food from the kitchen to the main house. At first, they did not speak. Tobias could not speak, and Celestine had learned that silence was safer than conversation. But over the weeks that followed, a form of communication developed between them: glances, gestures, the subtle language of people who share a common bondage. Celestine had come from a plantation where resistance was common. She had seen escape attempts. She had witnessed punishments. She had known people who had died rather than submit. And she carried within her a burning hatred for the system that had stolen her freedom. When she learned Tobias could read and write, everything changed. It was an accident. She found one of his hidden papers, a scrap on which he had been recording the week's events. She confronted him in the darkness behind the kitchen, her voice a fierce whisper. "You can write." Tobias nodded, terrified she would expose him. But Celestine did not expose him. Instead, she made a request. "Teach me." The lessons began in secret, conducted in stolen moments when Brossard's attention was elsewhere. Tobias used the same methods Marie Celeste had used with him, scratching letters in the dirt, guiding Celestine's hand to form the shapes that represented sounds. She learned quickly, more quickly than Tobias had learned, driven by an urgency he had not possessed during his years of relative comfort. Within 3 months, she could read simple words. Within 6 months, she could write her own name. This accomplishment might seem small. In a world where literacy was common, learning to write one's name would barely register as an achievement. But in the world of the Louisiana sugar plantation, it was revolutionary. Celestine had claimed ownership of herself in a way the law denied. She had written herself into existence. She had become more than property. And she was hungry for more. The year 1810 opened with rumors. Word spread through the enslaved communities of the German coast that something was coming. No one knew exactly what. No one knew exactly when. But the atmosphere had changed. There was electricity in the air, a sense of gathering force even the most isolated workers could feel. Charles Deslands had accelerated his plans. The reasons were complex. The American authorities were implementing new restrictions that would make future organizing more difficult. Several key allies had been sold to plantations outside the region, weakening the network, and the political situation in New Orleans was becoming increasingly unstable, creating opportunities that might not last. The revolution would come in January of 1811. It would be the largest slave revolt in American history. And it would fail. But in early 1810, no one knew how the story would end. Tobias received his first direct message from Deslands in March. It came through Celestine, who had connections to enslaved workers on neighboring plantations through the invisible networks that linked all enslaved communities. The message was simple: watch the river. Report what you see. Tobias began watching. From his position in the main house, he had access to information few enslaved people could obtain. He saw the correspondence Jean Noel received from other planters. He overheard conversations about militia movements and security measures. He learned which nights the patrols would be reduced and which routes were least watched. This information flowed through Celestine to contacts on other plantations, who passed it along to Deslands and his network. Tobias was now a spy. The moral implications of this decision haunted him. He was betraying the people who had sheltered him, the family that had, in their own twisted way, protected him from the worst fates that awaited enslaved children. He was putting himself at risk of torture and death. He was contributing to plans that would almost certainly result in violence. But he was also doing something else. He was fighting. For the first time in his life, he was not merely surviving. He was not simply enduring. He was actively working toward a future that might be different from the present. The feeling was intoxicating. The summer of 1810 brought Jean-Noël Destrehan out of his long mourning. He had spent nearly 18 months lost in grief and alcohol. But something had finally shifted. Perhaps the passage of time had dulled the pain. Perhaps the practical demands of running a plantation had become impossible to ignore. Perhaps he had simply grown tired of feeling broken. Whatever the reason, he began reasserting control. His first act was to summon Tobias. "I have been watching you," Jean-Noël said, his voice rough from months of disuse. "You have changed." Tobias stood silently, his face carefully blank. "My wife believed you had gifts, abilities that set you apart. I dismissed her beliefs as sentimentality." He paused. "I was wrong." Jean-Noël leaned forward. "3 times in the past month, you have done things that cannot be explained. You moved a stack of papers from my desk before a window shattered in a storm no one predicted. You positioned yourself near the door when a visitor arrived hours before anyone could have known he was coming. You avoided the path where a snake was hiding, a snake that bit the men who walked behind you." He stared at Tobias with an intensity that made the boy want to flee. "What are you?" Tobias could not answer. He could never answer in words. But he understood what Jean-Noël was asking. And he understood the danger of the question. If Jean-Noël believed Tobias had supernatural abilities, he might try to exploit them. He might become dependent on Tobias's predictions, elevating the boy to a position of unprecedented influence. This could provide protection and opportunity. Or it could make Tobias too valuable to ignore. It could draw attention from neighbors, from authorities, from people who would want to own a slave with such abilities for themselves. It could turn Tobias from a person into a prize. He made a decision. He shrugged. A simple gesture. A denial of anything extraordinary. Just coincidence. Just luck. Just a slave who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Jean-Noël studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said finally. "Perhaps it is nothing." But his eyes suggested he did not believe it. The autumn of 1810 brought the final pieces of Destrehan's plan into place. The revolution would begin on January 8, 1811. It would start at the plantation of Manuel Andre, where Destrehan worked as a driver. The rebels would seize weapons, kill or wound any whites who resisted, and march downriver toward New Orleans. Along the way, they would recruit additional fighters from every plantation they passed. The goal was not merely to escape. The goal was to conquer. Destrehan envisioned a free black republic in Louisiana, modeled on Haiti. He planned to capture New Orleans, seize the government buildings, and establish a new order. It was an audacious vision, almost certainly impossible, given the military forces arrayed against him. But impossible things sometimes happen. Tobias learned of the plan in December. Celestine brought him the details, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "It will happen in January," she said. "After the holidays, when the whites are relaxed and the patrols are reduced." "How many?" Tobias gestured, asking about the number of rebels. "Hundreds. Maybe more. Every plantation on the coast has people ready to join." Tobias processed this information. Hundreds of enslaved people rising simultaneously against their masters. It was unprecedented in American history. It was also, he calculated, almost certainly doomed. He had seen the militia records in Jean-Noël's study. He knew how many armed white men could be mobilized within hours. He understood the firepower the American authorities could bring to bear. The rebels had courage. They had numbers. They had justice on their side. But they did not have guns. He tried to communicate this to Celestine. He tried to explain that the mathematics of the situation did not favor the rebels. He tried to suggest that perhaps the plan should be reconsidered, that perhaps there were better ways to fight for freedom. Celestine listened. Then she spoke words Tobias would never forget. If we wait for the perfect moment, we will wait forever. If we only fight battles we can win, we will never fight at all. Sometimes you have to strike even when you know you might fail, because the alternative is to accept slavery forever. She was right. And Tobias knew she was right. But knowing did not make the coming violence any easier to contemplate. The morning of January 8, 1811, dawned cold and gray. Tobias woke before dawn, as he always did. He dressed in the darkness, prepared for another day of service in the household of Jean Noel Destrehan. He had no way of knowing this would be one of the most important days in American history. The first sign something was wrong came around 9 in the morning. A rider appeared on the river road. His horse lathered with sweat, his face twisted with panic. He demanded to see Jean Noel immediately. Tobias, who was attending to his duties in the main house, positioned himself where he could overhear the conversation. "Insurrection," the rider gasped. "At Andre's plantation. The slaves have risen. They killed Andre's son. They wounded Andre himself. They are marching this way." Jean Noel's face went white. "How many?" "Dozens. Maybe hundreds. They are gathering more as they march. They have weapons. They have drums. They are organized." For a moment, no one moved. The reality of the situation was too enormous to process. Everything the planters had feared, everything they had tried to prevent through violence and control and the constant assertion of white supremacy, was happening. The slaves were fighting back. Jean Noel recovered first. "Send word to New Orleans. Alert the militia. Arm every white man on this property." The next several hours were chaos. Tobias watched as Jean Noel organized the defense of the Destrehan Plantation. White men gathered with muskets and pistols. Enslaved workers were locked in the quarters, guarded by armed overseers. The road was barricaded. Preparations were made for either fight or flight. And throughout it all, Tobias felt a strange double consciousness. Part of him was terrified. If the rebels succeeded in reaching the Destrehan property, violence would follow. People would die. The world he knew would be destroyed. But another part of him felt something else entirely. Hope. For the first time in his life, the system that enslaved him was being challenged. For the first time, the people who had been treated as property were acting as agents of their own destiny. For the first time, the impossible was becoming possible. He found Celestine in the confusion of the morning. "It has begun," she whispered. Tobias nodded. "Will you go?" He gestured. "Will you join them?" He had thought about this question for weeks. He had imagined himself marching alongside Deslins, fighting for freedom with whatever weapons he could find. He had dreamed of being part of the revolution, of helping to build the new world the rebels envisioned. But he had also thought about something else. Someone needed to survive. Someone needed to remember what happened here. Someone needed to record the truth so future generations would know their ancestors had fought, that they had not accepted slavery passively, that they had been willing to die for freedom. Tobias gestured toward the main house. "I will stay. I will watch. I will remember." Celestine understood. "Then I will go," she said. "I will fight." She touched his face once, a gesture of farewell. Then she slipped away into the chaos, heading toward the river road where the rebels were approaching. Tobias never saw her again. The revolt of January 1811 lasted less than 3 days. Charles Deslins led between 200 and 500 rebels down the river road, recruiting additional fighters from every plantation they passed. They carried cane knives and axes and pikes. They had captured a few firearms from the Andre plantation, but not nearly enough. They marched to drums, organized into units, displaying a level of coordination that terrified the white population. They burned plantation houses. They destroyed crops. They killed 2 white men who tried to resist. And they came within 30 miles of New Orleans. But the response was overwhelming. Governor William C. Claiborne mobilized the territorial militia. General Wade Hampton, one of the largest slaveholders in the country, led 2 companies of volunteers. The United States Army and Navy contributed additional forces. Within 48 hours, nearly 700 armed soldiers were converging on the rebels from multiple directions. The final confrontation occurred on the morning of January 10 near the plantation of Jacques Fortier. The rebels had marched through the night, cold, hungry, running low on ammunition. They had hoped to reach New Orleans before the military could organize. They had hoped enslaved people in the city would rise to join them. They had hoped the impossible might somehow become real. But hope was not enough. The militia attacked at dawn. The rebels fought with extraordinary courage, holding their ground against enemies with superior weapons and training. But the outcome was never in doubt. When the battle ended, dozens of rebels lay dead. Others had scattered into the swamps, hoping to escape into the maroon communities that hid in the wilderness. The rest were captured, bound, and prepared for the judgment that awaited them. Charles Deslandes was among those who fled. He ran into the swamps behind the Picou and Trepignier plantations, hoping to disappear into the vast wetlands where he had once organized his network. But he was hunted by dogs and soldiers, tracked through the mud and water until he could run no more. When they captured him, they did not take him to trial. His owner, a man who shared the Deslandes name, was present when Charles was brought before the militia. The execution that followed was designed to send a message. They chopped off his hands. They shot him in one thigh, then the other, shattering the bones. They shot him in the body. And before he died, while he was still conscious and screaming, they placed him in a pile of straw and set it on fire. His dying cries echoed across the swamps, heard by escaped rebels hiding in the darkness. The message was clear: this is what happens when you fight back. Tobias witnessed the aftermath. He was present at the Destrehan Plantation on January 13, when the tribunal convened to judge the captured rebels. Jean-Noël Destrehan's property had been selected as the site for one of 3 simultaneous trials, a decision reflecting both his prominence in the community and the proximity of his plantation to the root of the rebellion. The tribunal was a mockery of justice. 67 enslaved people were put on trial across the 3 proceedings. The evidence against them consisted largely of accusations from white witnesses and confessions extracted through torture. The defendants had no lawyers. They had no opportunity to present their own testimony. The outcome was predetermined before the first word was spoken. At Destrehan, 21 men were condemned to death. Tobias knew some of them. He had passed information to their networks. He had contributed, in his small way, to the planning of the revolt. And now he stood in the shadows of the great house, watching as men were sentenced to die for seeking the freedom he also craved. The executions began on January 15. Each condemned man was taken to the plantation where he had been enslaved. He was shot in front of the assembled workers, a spectacle designed to terrorize the survivors into submission. Then his body was decapitated, and his head was mounted on a pole along the river road. By the time the executions were complete, nearly 100 heads lined the road from New Orleans to the site of the revolt. The display was intended as a warning: look what happens when you resist. Look what happens when you dream of freedom. Look what happens when you forget your place. But for Tobias, the display meant something different. Each head was a human being. Each head had a name, a history, a network of relationships and hopes and fears. Each head represented someone who had chosen to fight rather than submit, to risk death rather than accept endless bondage. Each head was a hero. And Tobias was determined their heroism would not be forgotten. In the weeks following the revolt, Tobias began the most dangerous project of his life. He wrote everything down. Working in stolen moments, hiding his materials in places no one would think to search, he created a record of what had happened. He documented the names of the rebels, as many as he could learn. He described the tribunal, the mockery of justice that had condemned innocent men alongside actual participants. He recorded the executions, the display of heads, the terror that gripped the German coast in the aftermath of the uprising. He wrote about Charles Deslandes. He wrote about the vision of freedom that had motivated the revolt. He wrote about the courage of people who had known they would probably die but had chosen to fight anyway. And he wrote about Celestine. He never learned what happened to her. She had disappeared into the chaos of the revolt, joining the rebels as they marched toward New Orleans. She might have died in the battle. She might have been captured and executed. She might have escaped into the swamps, living among the Maroons who continued to resist. But whatever her fate, Tobias refused to let her be forgotten. He wrote her name. He described her courage. He recorded the lessons she had taught him about resistance and hope and the necessity of fighting even when victory seemed impossible. She had changed him. She had shown him survival was not enough, that there were things worth dying for. And she had given him a purpose. The document Tobias created in the months following the revolt was unlike anything that existed at the time. It was a slave narrative written by an enslaved person, recording events as they happened rather than recollected years later in freedom. It was a primary source of extraordinary historical value, documenting the largest slave revolt in American history from the perspective of someone who had lived through it. But it was also evidence. If the document was discovered, Tobias would face torture and death. If the names he had recorded were traced to their sources, other enslaved people would suffer. If the information he had gathered was connected to the planning of the revolt, the retribution would extend far beyond his own punishment. He hid the document carefully. He buried sections in different locations around the plantation. He encoded portions using a cipher Marie Celeste had taught him years earlier. He created multiple copies, storing them in places where they might survive even if he did not. And then he waited. The years that followed the revolt were the darkest of Tobias's life. The authorities implemented brutal new restrictions on the enslaved population. Movement was limited. Gatherings were prohibited. Punishment for the smallest infractions became severe. The atmosphere of terror the planters had created was designed to ensure nothing like the 1811 revolt would ever happen again. Jean-Noël Destrehan died in 1823. His death brought changes to the plantation Tobias had called home for nearly 2 decades. The property passed to new owners who had no connection to the strange boy who had once lived in the mansion. Tobias was sold. He passed through several hands over the following years, moving from plantation to plantation across Louisiana. Each sale was a new trauma, a reminder he was property, that his body and labor belonged to whoever held his bill of sale. But he carried something with him that could not be sold. He carried the stories. He carried the names of the rebels. He carried the memory of Celestine's courage. He carried the words Charles Deslandes had spoken years earlier about the choice every enslaved person would eventually face. And he carried the knowledge that resistance was possible. He taught that knowledge to others. Wherever he was sold, he found ways to connect with the enslaved communities around him. He shared what he knew about reading and writing. He passed along the techniques of organization Deslandes had developed. He kept alive the memory of 1811, telling the story to young people born after the revolt who knew nothing of what their predecessors had attempted. The document he had created was eventually recovered, not in his lifetime, not for many generations. But fragments survived, hidden in the places he had buried them, preserved by the accident of history that allows some things to endure while others are destroyed. When historians finally pieced together the story of the German coast uprising, they found references to an enslaved person who had lived in the Destrehan mansion, a mute boy who had witnessed the tribunal and recorded what he saw. The references were fragmentary, incomplete, tantalizing glimpses of a story that could never be fully reconstructed. But they were enough. They were enough to know Tobias had existed. They were enough to know he had fought in his own way, using the only weapons available to him. They were enough to know that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings find ways to resist, to preserve truth, to assert their humanity against systems designed to deny it. The Destrehan Plantation still stands today. Visitors can tour the restored buildings, walk through the spaces where Jean-Noël and Marie Celeste once lived, see the quarters where enslaved people were housed. The plantation hosts educational programs about the history of slavery, including exhibits about the 1811 revolt and the tribunal that took place on its grounds. But what the official tours cannot show is the full story. They cannot show the secret lessons that took place in the garden when a white woman taught a black child to read. They cannot show the hidden documents buried in locations never found. They cannot show the network of communication linking enslaved communities across the German coast, the invisible infrastructure of resistance that made the revolt possible. And they cannot show Tobias. His name does not appear in the official records. His story was not preserved in the archives historians consult. He was erased, as countless enslaved people were erased, his existence deemed unworthy of documentation by the people who controlled the historical record. But erasure is not the same as destruction. Tobias lived. Tobias witnessed. Tobias recorded. And through the fragments that survived, through the stories passed down, through the evidence that emerged from unlikely sources, his testimony endured. The lessons of his life are not simple. He was saved by a slaveholder, educated by an oppressor, sheltered by people who profited from the suffering of his people. He survived by hiding, by dissembling, by pretending to be less than he was. He made compromises that troubled his conscience. He chose safety over solidarity in moments that haunted him the rest of his life. But he also fought. He fought with the only weapons he possessed. He fought by learning, by teaching, by preserving truth. He fought by refusing to accept the lies the system told about him. He fought by remembering the names of the forgotten, by honoring the courage of the fallen, by bearing witness to atrocities powerful men wanted buried. His fight did not end slavery. It did not free a single person. It did not change the immediate circumstances of his own bondage. But it mattered. It mattered because truth matters. It mattered because memory matters. It mattered because the struggle for justice does not end when one generation falls, but continues through the next, carried forward by those who refuse to forget. Charles Deslandes understood this. When he led 500 people against the most powerful nation on earth, he knew he would probably fail. He knew the mathematics were against him, that the weapons were insufficient, that the forces arrayed in opposition were overwhelming. But he also knew the act of resistance itself had value. He knew his rebellion would be remembered, that it would inspire future generations, that it would prove enslaved people were not the docile property slaveholders pretended them to be. He was right. The German coast uprising of 1811 was suppressed with terrible violence. Its leaders were executed. Its participants were massacred. Its goals were not achieved. But it was not defeated. The memory of the uprising lived on in the enslaved communities of Louisiana. It inspired future resistance. It contributed to the growing abolitionist movement that would eventually challenge slavery throughout the United States. It demonstrated that freedom was worth dying for, that human beings would not accept bondage forever, that the system of slavery contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And the story continued. 50 years after the revolt, the Civil War erupted. Enslaved people throughout the South fled to Union lines, fought in the Union Army, contributed in countless ways to the destruction of the system that had oppressed them. When emancipation finally came, it came in part because of the resistance that had been building for generations, the accumulated pressure of millions of people who refused to accept they were property. The rebels of 1811 were part of that pressure. Their sacrifice mattered. Their courage mattered. Their willingness to fight mattered. And Tobias, the mute boy who lived in the mansion, who witnessed the tribunal, who recorded the truth, was part of that story, too. His life spanned the darkest period of American slavery. He was born into bondage, lived his entire life as property, died without ever experiencing freedom. By conventional measures, his existence was a tragedy, defined by suffering and limitation and the constant denial of his humanity. But conventional measures do not capture the whole truth. Tobias preserved something precious. He carried the stories of people who would otherwise have been forgotten. He maintained the flame of resistance through decades of darkness. He proved that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to assert itself, to fight back, to refuse surrender. This is the lesson of his impossible life. Not that resistance always succeeds. Not that courage is always rewarded. Not that justice always triumphs, but that resistance matters anyway. That courage has value beyond its practical results. That justice is worth pursuing even when victory seems impossible. The boy found sleeping in the Destrehan mansion in 1804 should not have survived. He should not have been educated. He should not have witnessed history being made. He should not have left any trace of his existence. But he did. He survived against all odds. He learned what he was forbidden to learn. He saw what powerful men wanted hidden. And he ensured the truth would outlast the lies. That is his legacy. That is what makes his story worth telling. And that is why, more than 200 years later, we still speak his name. Tobias. The impossible boy who lived. The witness who remembered. The voice that could not be silenced.